Hello and welcome. Big Talk with Todd and Noah, episode number 11, presented by Xfinity 10G Network. Glad to have you along as always. Another week of college football in the books. Todd, we've got a lot to get to, so let's just get right to your reactions from a busy week 10.
Yeah, I think first of all, it was interesting that the 5 undefeated teams that are the top 5 in the first college football playoff poll all won. They all, had some tough games for a while, but all won to stay undefeated. And this is the first time since the college football playoff started in the 10-year history that the top 5 ranked teams are still undefeated this late in the season. So
Wow.
it's they're not going to stay that way, obviously, because Ohio State and Michigan play each other. There's some big games down the stretch, but it is kind of interesting that that's the situation right now. And it's going to make for some very interesting discussion for us and for the playoff committee as this thing goes down the final 3 weeks of the regular season.
Very interesting. I didn't realize that undefeated mark. That is pretty impressive. And obviously, Washington continues to just kind of get things done and find ways to win. We'll get to that in a second. Let's start in the Big 12 because there were 2 big games in particular. Texas has kind of worked their way back after the early season victory to Alabama, then the Oklahoma loss, and then beating Kansas State this week in overtime. And then the second one that we really need to hit on is that last Bedlam game, maybe ever. I expect that at some point they're going to find a way to play each other again, but they're not going to play every year, obviously, with Oklahoma moving to the SEC next year. So Oklahoma State wins the final Bedlam game. Just those 2 from the Big 12 really stood out, and those are the 2 we were interested in going into the week.
Yeah, I think, first of all, the Texas win, valiant effort by Kansas State coming back on the road. They went on a 20-0 run in the second half, got the game tied, got the game into overtime. Texas scored first in overtime on a field goal. And Coach Kleinman decided to go for the win, and they went for a 4th and 4 instead of kicking a field goal that would have extended the game, and they got stopped. And Texas won the game. So a big win for Texas because everything's still kind of right in front of them. But Malik Murphy has made good plays. He's made mistakes in playing in place of Quinn Ewers. The good news for Texas is right now Quinn Ewers is listed as day-to-day, according to Steve Sarkisian. He's throwing, and they need him back as the quarterback, I think, to really get to where they want to go this season.
Yeah, no question about it. And by the way, I'm a big proponent for going for the win. I'm a big proponent because at that point, right, you end up going double, triple, whatever, overtime. You're going to eventually have to go for the 2 anyway. So at that point, you might as well. It's like going for that earlier in the game and deciding whether or not you're going to win the game. So I love the decision. I know it didn't work out for Kansas State, but I love the decision and a good win for Texas.
I get that. I get that. However, and I get it, especially when you're on the road, right? On the road, you're going to go for the win right now and get it done. The only thing I would say against that is in that particular matchup, you had the advantage at quarterback. Your guy was more experienced, more seasoned, and I would put my money on him in overtime as opposed to the new starter at Texas. But you could make an argument either way. And Chris Kleinman has done a phenomenal job at Kansas State. They are a hard out for anybody. So an exciting football game. Then you mentioned Bedlam, 118 years of history. How ironic, right? Mike Gunday, who's been very outspoken about Oklahoma leaving and, going to the SEC and ending their relationship in this game. And he gets his 100th victory in the final, what appears to be the final Bedlam game for at least the foreseeable future, right? So 27-24, an upset. And this is a series, ironically, totally dominated by Oklahoma in the history. Oklahoma had a 91-20 to 7 advantage, right? So Oklahoma State doesn't win very often, but they got bragging rights now for the next however many years based on what they were able to do in Stillwater this past weekend.
They know where their bread is buttered. Ollie Gordon had 2 touchdowns on the ground. Alan Bowman over 300 yards and rushing touchdown as well for him. Dylan Gabriel played pretty well. Wasn't as explosive maybe as he's been at times of the season, but still didn't really put the ball in harm's way. It was just a good, hard victory for Oklahoma State. And the best part, I know I showed you in the car after our game, they played "We Are Never Ever Getting Back Together" by Taylor Swift after the win, which is just the perfect amount of petty. That is petty white,
Yeah.
if you ask me. So I like that. Other things in the Big 12, Houston, UCF, both picking up their first Big 12 win. So congratulations to both of the newer members of the conference.
And just one more point about Oklahoma State, because people kind of are overlooking this. Maybe they won 5 in a row now, right? Yeah. And their road to Arlington to play potentially Texas for the Big 12 championship game. Now they've got 3 games left against 4-5 UCF, 4-5 Houston, and 5-4 BYU. So all 3 newcomers into the Big 12. Oklahoma State, that's what they've got left on their schedule, and they control their own destiny to get to the Big 12 championship game in Arlington.
What's crazy is I don't remember who I was talking to about it this weekend, but as we're getting ready for this Bedlam game and everything going into it, you're like, man, Mike Gundy said, I'm a man, I'm 40, like 15, 16, 17 years ago. It feels like yesterday. He's been there forever, it feels like. And all he's done is had success. Other than, I believe, his first year of the program, he's been a bowl eligible team every year. And most years they're 8, 9, 10 wins. I think he just deserves a lot of credit for the sustained success he's had over there. And as you mentioned, a big win for him personally, and certainly for the program moving forward for those bragging rights. SEC-wise, we're going to keep saying it each week. Guess who won again?
Here they are
again. Number 8, Alabama will continue to move up in both the AP poll and probably at some point this college football playoff ranking as well. But they beat LSU in what was a critical game for Jalen Milroe and this team, 42-28. Now, look, Jaden Daniels did go down and didn't return to the game. That obviously played a role down the stretch because it was close for the majority of this back and forth. But again, a lot of credit to Jalen Milroe, a lot of credit to Alabama and their offensive staff for just kind of leaning into what he does well. And the defense continues to find ways to get stops in critical moments.
Yeah, this game was similar to the Bedlam game. I mean, if you paid for a ticket to go to this game, you got to see an entertaining game. 985 total yards in the game, 507 for Alabama, 478 for LSU. And Jalen Milroe, probably his best game, right? At the biggest stage, 374 total yards, outdueled Jaden Daniels, and Alabama ended up running for 288 yards in the game. So Alabama's offense doing, a little bit of everything. Their defense continues to play well, even though they gave up points. But, Jaden Daniels killed him last year and beat him. And he had another big game against him until he went out. But a very big win for Alabama as they just kind of keep marching towards Atlanta.
So the question is, who are they going to face? I mean, it feels like it's likely that we know the answer, and it's going to be the back-to-back champs, considering another just kind of prove-it game for them this past week. In Georgia, it wasn't pretty necessarily. It wasn't dominant necessarily, but it was a win, 30-21 over Missouri, and that's a very good Missouri team that led 13-10 early in the second half before Georgia just kind of took over down the stretch in that second half, and Carson Beck really found his rhythm late.
Carson Beck's played really, really well. A lot of people, including myself, wondered how would the offense, function without Brock Bowers in the lineup after his injury, and they've just kind of kept it going. So, and a lot of that credit goes to the quarterback. He's playing very well. This was a game that Missouri's a good football team, right? This game was 24-21 early in the fourth quarter. Then it was 27-21 later, and the game kind of turned on an interception by a defensive lineman. Nazir Stackhouse, picked one off, returned it to the Missouri 5-yard line. That enabled them to go up 30-21. But that's a hard fought win and a pretty impressive effort by Missouri on the road. And now Missouri has a chance. They've got Tennessee coming to visit this week. So still another big game for them on the eastern side. But Georgia is playing really well. And they appear to be, heading back to Atlanta, which is just down the road for them, but kind of their home away from home in the SEC championship game.
Oh, there's no days off in the SEC, to your point. And I think that there's no better example from last week than Ole Miss, Texas A&M, because Ole Miss comes into the game playing really, really good football, feeling like, this is a game that we should control. And A&M gave them a ride. It was 38-35, the final. A nice job by Ole Miss to kind of hold off what the Aggies, the fight they put forth, so to speak. But just another kind of example of what the SEC is like, obviously every year, but this year has been, I feel like, even more bunched up than we tend to expect.
Yeah, I mean, Ole Miss is a top 10 team, and I think deservedly so. They've got really good offensive balance. Jackson Dart had a really nice game at quarterback, threw for 380 some yards. Uh, their running back Quinshon Judkins is if you haven't seen him, he's an outstanding player. Had a great freshman year last year, picked up right where he left off this year as a sophomore. So they've got a nice run pass balance. We'll find out a lot more about Ole Miss because they travel to Athens this week.
Yep.
To play Georgia. So they've only got one loss, and that loss was to Alabama earlier in the year. Now they get a chance to take on the other big boy in the league in Athens against Georgia. But Lane Kiffin's got a good football team that can move the football and score offensively.
That's a promise. The Lane train's going to be entertaining no matter where they are, no matter where that destination is. All aboard, because this week will be a big one, and I'm sure we'll break it down after the final result there. Pac-12, so it's funny because you got the SEC on one side that I'm sure everybody who's affiliated with that conference is going to say it's the best conference in college football again. And then you got the Pac-12 on the other side, essentially, of the country. And everybody there is going to say they're the best conference in football right now. And look, they've got a lot of really good teams. USC has fallen off a little bit. Utah has not been quite the same as what they were without Cam Rising, but they're still very good. But let's start with that Washington SC game, because I think everybody saw a couple things out of this one. One, the result, which was Alex Grinch getting let go after hanging 52, did Washington on USC. And in the last two games, giving up 100-plus points, I believe, something at least close to it. I'd have to double-check what the score was the week before. But they've given up a lot of points. And I think I saw that in the last 6 games, they've given up either more or just about as many points as Iowa has in the last 2 seasons combined. So that USC defense is definitely – it's the point that everybody's been looking at. And, again, you're going up against one of the best offenses in the country. The second thing I think everybody saw from this game was – and Matt just gave us the exact total, 49 last week, 52 this week. So over 100 the last 2 weeks combined. Not ideal defensively. The other thing everyone saw was Caleb Williams and his reaction after the game and just how emotional he was. He played well, and he generally does. The only game he really hasn't played to his standard, it feels like, was that Notre Dame game. Right. Every other game, he may have had not quite the gaudy numbers, but he's played like Caleb Williams, and he put his team in position to succeed. It's just another good win for Washington, and that offense continues to hum, and they're pushing just each week, getting closer to that college football playoff.
Yeah, it's interesting because Washington's offense, after the win against Oregon a few weeks ago, for the next few weeks, their offense was not really hitting on all cylinders. Well, the perfect remedy was to play USC defense, and they exploded 572 yards and 52 points. And I think everybody tuned into that game expecting a major shootout between Caleb Williams and Michael Penix Jr., and they both played well. Penix Jr. threw for 256 and 2 touchdowns. But the real difference in the game was Washington's ability to run the football. They had 316 yards rushing against the Trojan defense. Dylan Johnson, who wasn't even the starting tailback when the season began, they lost their number 1 tailback to an injury before the year even started. He had 26 carries, 256 yards and 4 touchdowns. So a very impressive offensive game for Washington. Look, I hate when coaches get fired. Alex Grinch is a good dude. He's a good football coach, but he just never could get it done. He couldn't get it done with Lincoln in Oklahoma, and they just weren't able to, even with more talent available at USC on that side of the ball, able to get it done there. And I will say this, being a defensive coordinator for Lincoln Riley with the offense that they have and the way they play offense is not an easy job. And so whoever goes in there next will understand that, it's an air raid team that is in the shotgun all the time, and their running game, they like to run the football, but it's a finesse running game more than it is a power running game. And you don't get to practice certain things or certain ways against some things you're going to see from other teams in that you play. And that's going to be true, when they come into the Big Ten. You think about USC coming into the Big Ten. They're going to see people that are going to line up with 2 tight ends and pound the football. Well, when you have that kind of an offense that USC has, you can't get a scout team necessarily. Even if you go ones-on-ones, you're not going to get the same look or the same feel of that kind of power football. So, It'll be interesting to see who Lincoln Riley brings in next. There's been a lot of names, being bounced around. One that I find the most intriguing right now is Jim Leonard, who, was the former Wisconsin defensive coordinator who is not coaching this year, but he's on Illinois staff as kind of an analyst. He doesn't work on game day, but he works during the week. And if he's itching to get back in the saddle as a defensive coordinator, that could be a very interesting arrangement there as USC gets ready to come into the Big Ten.
So that's a fascinating point, because I don't think anybody, myself included, thinks about having to practice against an air raid style that Lincoln runs. And to your point, he wants to run the football, but not the same way of what they're going to see. That's completely interesting. And Jim Leonard would be the reason that I think Jim would be so good for them is because his identity, his personality, what he was as a player is what they need. They need that toughness, right? They need somebody who is the fundamental perfection. That's what Jim Leonard thrived on over the course of his college and then long NFL career. Was he wasn't going to miss tackles. He was going to make sure he was in the right spot every time. And against the run, he was sniffing it out from the safety spot as well as anybody. So that'll be an interesting search for them moving forward. They've given up. Yeah, go for it.
No, I was just going to say, you know what it's going to be like. It's very similar to, remember, of course, we have them again this week, but the last time we had Ohio State and the conversation we had with Jim Knowles, they talked about having to convince the defensive players that, hey, look, let's not concede competition to this offense. We know they're a great offense. We know they're explosive. We know their wide receivers are great, but go out there and compete every day in practice. And let's believe that we are good enough to win games on the defensive side of the ball. Now they're doing that this year. I mean, Ohio State's defense has been consistently outstanding from game one till now. So the offense has had some ups and downs. They've had some injuries, but the defense has really carried the day for Ohio State. And part of that is just a mindset that, look, just because we have an explosive offense doesn't mean we can't have a dominant defense. And they've got that right now. And that's what USC ultimately should have because of their resources, their recruiting base, their ability to attract talent. They should be able to have a dominant defense to go with Lincoln Riley's offense.
Yeah, and they've got a rich history of great backers and defensive backs. And I mean, not to mention guys who are just entering the league now. Tui Pelotu had like 4 sacks last night on Monday Night Football and continues to do great things for the Los Angeles Chargers. So it's interesting. It'll be interesting. USC has given up 40 or more points 5 of their last 6 games. So we'll see what the final rest of the season looks like for them. The other team to hit on in the Pac-12 would just be Oregon. And it's business as usual for the Ducks over Cal, 63-19. Bo Nix, I know that they lost the one game to Washington, and Michael Penix technically is going to be in the driver's seat for the Heisman, so long as that's the case. Now they could meet up in the Pac-12 championship and things could change. But I mean, look at the numbers he had last week for Bo Nix: 386, 4 touchdowns, 2 rushing touchdowns. There's no reason that he can't be right at the top of the list for that Heisman conversation.
Absolutely. And part of that is the biggest game. And again, as a voter in the Heisman, I pay attention to how those guys play in the biggest games, And, you think about Michael Penix Jr. and Washington, they're sitting there in great position. But the teams they have left on their schedule in the regular season, they've got Utah next, who's 7-2. And is always a physical, tough team. Then they go to Oregon State, who is also 7-2 and playing good football. Then they finish up with the Apple Cup against Washington State, who is kind of on a downward spiral right now, but that's an in-state rivalry game. Then potentially another rematch with Oregon. So there are no easy games in there the rest of the way out for Michael Penix Jr. And so, this Heisman thing, there's still some interesting games for all the main contenders here down the stretch.
One of which we'll talk about in just a moment in Marvin Harrison Jr. and what that looked like last week heading into this week. Let's just quickly hit on Clemson Notre Dame before we move on to the Big Ten.
Yeah.
I think that everybody expected that Clemson, given the way the season had gone, and Notre Dame feeling a little bit of momentum, this would be Irish from start to finish. This would be controlled by Sam Howell, going back to a place he's very familiar with in the ACC. And it was the complete opposite. Notre Dame ends up falling to 7-3 with a 31-23 loss. They made a nice comeback after Clemson jumped out to a fairly big lead early. And Sam Hartman's now 0-5 in his career against the Tigers. It's just something that he's never gotten over, dating back to Wake Forest, and a really tough loss for Notre Dame when it's all said and done.
Yeah. First of all, Dabo, who's had an interesting couple weeks, right? He became the winningest coach in Clemson football history with 166 wins with this game. The defense of Clemson was outstanding. I mean, they pressured Sam Hartman. They held him to 146 yards of passing, picked him off twice. One was a pick six. They were without their starting tailback, their best running back. Phil Maffa came in, carried it 36 times for 186 yards and 2 touchdowns. So a really impressive, complete win by Clemson. And, some of those fans sitting there from Clemson, you mentioned Sam's 0-5, but ACC fans, the last 2 years Sam was at Wake Forest, even though he did a lot of great things, and I love him as a player, he threw 26 interceptions the last 2 years of his career in the ACC. And so, when he's had problems, it's been, throwing the ball in harm's way. And, it came back and got him here in Death Valley again.
I swear, Jeremiah Trotter Jr., every time I watch a Clemson game, he somehow gets more and more impressive with each game. 11 tackles, pick 6 in the second quarter. He's had multiple pick 6s this year. He's had multiple game-swinging plays this year. He's just awesome. He really is. And Xavier Watts did have another solid game for Notre Dame. His 7th interception of the year. He had obviously the huge one against USC a couple weeks ago. Just other ones just to hit on and mention scores. Florida State 24-7 win over Pitt. Jordan Travis with another big game. And then Army ends the unbeaten season of Air Force, who was in the top 25, 23-3. That's an offensive explosion for Army.
Yeah, I think they were saying, hey, wait a minute, Air Force, everybody's handing them the Commander-in-Chief trophy, and Army says, not so fast, my friend. We're going to come in here and set things straight. So always fun to watch those academy teams go at each other.
Very much so. All right, let's head to the Big Ten. Start with Ohio State, number 1 in the college football playoff ranking last week. In all likelihood, they'll stay there, but it wasn't simple against Rutgers. And again, a lot of credit to Greg Schiano's team for the way they battled. And honestly, if there's a couple more things that go maybe the other way, 1 bounce, 2 bounces, 1 pass that gets caught, this could have looked a little different. Ohio State pulled away late, 35-16, but Rutgers was up 9-7 at half. They could have been up more if they had punched a couple in. So this was a game that, honestly, if you didn't believe in Rutgers before, I feel like you got to leave this game believing in what they've done this year and what they're going to have moving forward. But business as usual, and that defense, again, for the Buckeyes comes through.
So let's talk about Rutgers first. Here's what's real about Rutgers and legitimate. Number 1, they came into the game ranked in the top 10 in total defense. Okay. So Greg Schiano is a very good defensive football coach, defensive mind, and they play solid defense. Okay. They played well against Michigan earlier in the year.
Yep.
Okay. Till late when Michigan kind of took control of the game. So that's legit. They can legit run the football. Okay. Yep. Kyle Monangai is an outstanding running back, runs hard. And Gavin Wimsatt, who's not a great passer right now, can also run the football. So their ability to run the football is real. They had a perfect plan going into this game, right? Control the ball, run it, limit the possessions Ohio State had. They would let the play clock go down just about every play. They were shortening the game, right? And it was, other than what you mentioned, that they couldn't get touchdowns when they were in the red zone. And credit Ohio State's defense for being stingy when they got down there, having to settle for field goals. They still had the lead at half, and they were getting the opening kickoff to start the third quarter. And they marched all the way down the field.
Yep.
And there was the play that turned the game was at the end of that drive. They're on about the 15-yard line. They tried a little kind of fake the quarterback power and a pop pass to the back. And Josh Proctor, the safety who got hurt on the play, made a great play on the ball. Ball went up in the air, and it was returned 93 yards for a touchdown by Ohio State. And that's when the game changed and went in the favor of the Buckeyes. And they kind of started feeding the ball in the second half to Travion Henderson. I think he had 78 yards in the second half. And as we saw the last Ohio State game, they are a different team, particularly on the offensive side of the ball, when Travion Henderson is on the field. I mean, Marvin Harrison is still the best player on their team, but he only had 4 catches for 25 yards. 2 of them were for touchdowns. but Travion Henderson kind of put the team on his back in the second half, and that's how Ohio State was able to kind of distance themselves from Rutgers when it was all said and done.
That interception, that pick six, wasn't necessarily completely on Gavin Wimsatt. As you mentioned, he's not necessarily a natural passer yet, and I think he's working towards that. He was a fairly highly touted recruit getting to Rutgers and has really proven to be a solid leader so far, a really good runner of the football. If he can develop that passing a little bit, if he can develop that throwing mechanics and just accuracy and everything that goes with it, Rutgers the next couple of years will be fun. And I think that they've got all the infrastructure in place with Greg Schiano. So a lot of it, I think you don't like to say they're moral victories, and I don't think Greg Schiano's a moral victory type of guy. But if you were to take some, I think Rutgers has a lot to be excited and proud about the way that they fought in that game. But Ohio State finds their way. That 93-yard pick six, as Todd mentioned, was kind of the igniter, and then they went from there. We'll talk about Marvin when we get to our game this week, because I do want to ask you a little bit more about that. But let's go to the game we did last week. And that's Michigan, number 3 in the college football playoff ranking. A lot of noise surrounding the program, of course. And it wasn't necessarily the complete dominance over Purdue.
Right.
The scoreboard will read 41-13. Those last 7 points from Purdue were with, 7-8 seconds left. They get a fourth down touchdown from Hudson Card going to Deion Burks. But Blake Corum, 3 more touchdowns. He leads the country. He only had 44 yards, but he's got, 16, 17 rushing touchdowns at this point on the season. It just continues to churn. It's all goal-to-go situations, it feels like. They had 5 touchdowns. All of them were rushing, did Michigan. 1 from Donovan Edwards, 1 from Samaj Morgan, the wide receiver. Again, it wasn't dominant, but considering everything that's going on with the program, to get the win after the bye week, to just kind of maintain business as usual. J.J. McCarthy wasn't as spectacular as he's been through the course of the year. The defense was still unbelievable and really hard to beat.
Yeah, I think the reason it didn't feel quite as dominant is just because Purdue's defense, after the first couple of possessions, really kind of settled in and played okay. Now, there was never a sense that Purdue's offense was going to threaten Michigan's defense ever. They just were never going to muster anything against the Wolverine defense. And the fact is, Michigan is not just running the ball down people's throat as much as they did the last couple of years. That doesn't mean Blake Corum's not having a good year. He is. Donovan Edwards is having a good year, but he's not had the breakaway runs. But their passing game has really taken over and is kind of carrying the offense. I mean, J.J. McCarthy maybe didn't complete 78% of his passes, but he still threw for over 300 yards, right? Roman Wilson still had a huge game with 9 catches. So the passing game has made Michigan a different football team this year. They don't have the same running numbers, but the passing game is much more efficient than it was a year ago.
Michigan, first real test for most people, I would say. Most people believe their first real test this week. That's going to be against Penn State, which the Nittany Lions were the last couple of weeks looking a little bit shaky following that first loss to Ohio State. I think they quelled a lot of those concerns against Maryland this past week. 51-15, the final score.
Yeah, I think most people were able to accept, what happened in Columbus, even though the offense, was not good on third down and Drew Aller, did not play well. But what really made people wonder is how they played against Indiana at home the following week. And they could have very easily lost that game. But they put all of those questions aside against Maryland. They played really well. Their defense, similar to Ohio State, similar to Michigan, has been good all year. Right? I mean, their defense has really shown up every week. The offense has been spotty and up and down, but Drew Aller had a solid game, 240 yards, 4 touchdown passes. Keandre Lambert-Smith is still their go-to guy, but they finally had another receiver step up. Dante Cephas had, I think, 6 catches, 2 touchdowns. They've been waiting for another receiver, a second receiver to kind of emerge. And so Katron Allen had nearly 100, I think 93 yards rushing. So that was a huge game for Penn State from a confidence standpoint and a mindset standpoint offensively as they get ready to welcome Michigan into Happy Valley on Saturday.
Spiral continues for Maryland's 4 straight losses after the 5-0 start. Talia Tungavailoa had nearly 300 yards and 2 touchdowns. They couldn't really get anything going on the ground, which was surprising considering some of the personnel they have in the backfield. And Delmar Glaze is a very good offensive lineman up front. They just couldn't find anything. And a lot of that is because of Penn State's front seven defensively. I mean, they've got some just unbelievable players up front, and Abdul Carter's kind of an eraser in that middle line as well.
Yeah, I don't, and I don't want to take anything away from Penn State's defense because I've already said they're outstanding. I'm just still scratching my head about what happened to Maryland.
Yeah.
Because, we saw them lose to Illinois and had studied on film how they played against Ohio State. And I thought they played great against Ohio State until the end, till the fourth quarter. And then they had the injuries going to that Illinois game, and they just have not recovered. And I think they've gotten worse, which, you hope to be playing your best football as the season wears on. And unfortunately for Maryland, I don't think they are. And so, it's not going to get any easier. I think they go to Nebraska this week, right? And Nebraska is going to try to get back on the winning track. It could be blustery, windy, cold, everything in Lincoln. And that's a physical defense. So it won't get any easier for Mike Loxley's team to try to get this thing turned around. Because right now, they're on the verge of maybe not being bowl eligible, which was hard to imagine 3 weeks ago.
Completely. And that matchup, it's going to be the battle for bowl eligibility because Nebraska felt like they had a golden opportunity fall through their hands and last week against Michigan State. So will be interesting. Just the other scores to hit on. Iowa, we don't really need to go deep into the Iowa and Northwestern game at Wrigley Field. That was a 10-7 final score. Drew Stevens, go-ahead field goal, 17 seconds left. And Iowa gets back in the top spot in the Big Ten West when it's all said and done.
Yeah, doing it their way,
what they do,
way, right? I mean, first of all, Northwestern scored to tie the game at 7 with 1:50 left in the game. Okay.
Yes, that's correct.
They had a possession earlier than that where they went for it on the goal line on 4th down and got stopped. So it was still 7-0. Well, then they scored to tie it up, and there was 17 seconds left. Iowa wins the game 10-7. So, just a total slugfest. And, Vegas must have, they were right on setting the lowest under, whatever. And how, I don't even know how that worked. But, 17 total points is pretty low.
Yeah. I can't wait to tell you that next week's over-under is lower. So they're playing Rutgers, and it was 29.5 this past week. It's 28.5 against Rutgers. So we'll see who prevails there. And by the way, I think taking the under is still not the worst idea. All the other Big Ten West teams that were tied at the top all fell. Wisconsin loses to Indiana. Congrats to IU on their first Big Ten win of the season, 20-14. Illinois over Minnesota in a back-and-forth game, 27-26. So the Gophers fall from that top spot. And then, as mentioned, first win for Harlan Barnett as the interim head coach, the acting head coach. Michigan State over Nebraska, 20-17. That was the last game at Spartan Stadium, so of the year. They had the kind of log jam up front in their schedule where they played all those early games at home, and they've barely been at home since. And that last game of the year we'll be at is at Ford Field in Detroit. So really just congratulations to Harlan Barnett to get that win.
Yeah, I'm happy for him, and that whole staff. Look, my dad was a coach for 40 years, and my dad was a coach on some teams that didn't win much. And that's tough because you got to come back. You don't change things. You don't quit trying as hard as you can, coaching as hard as you can, practicing as hard. And when you don't have the results or anything to show for it, it's really, really difficult, right? Especially you got outside noise, and especially now with social media, people telling you how terrible you are and, you stink and you can't win, can't play. And that's hard. It's hard for 18 to 22-year-olds, right? So I'm happy for Harlan Barnett. I'm happy for the kids that they got to win. In fact, both Michigan State and Indiana both ended 6-game losing streaks last weekend. And, so happy for all of those players and coaches on both teams. Tom Allen for Indiana. That was a great win for him as well. Illinois with their win, Luke Altmaier had 3 touchdown passes, but he got hurt. And they had to bring in the backup quarterback because they had to go right down to the wire to win the game. But Isaiah Williams had a huge game. I think he had 13 catches in the game and was, really the star of the show for Illinois. So a really good win for Brett Bielema's team as well.
He's a stud. As we move on to the previews for this week, let's start with Michigan and Penn State. We mentioned it. That's at noon. That's on Fox. It is, again, from the outsider's perspective, most people talking would say, all right, this is where we're going to find out if Michigan is for real. You look at their schedule, they've beaten up on teams that in all likelihood they should beat up on. This is a team, not just a team, but an environment where you're going on the road, you're playing in hostile waters, and Drew Aller has had the experience already now against Ohio State a couple weeks ago of what this big game's supposed to feel like. We know J.J. McCarthy is seasoned. We know he's going to be prepared. I'm curious how both teams respond in this one, but for Michigan, with everything going on, with the way that they've played through this season, it feels like if they go on the road and thoroughly control this game, it kind of changes the narrative what their season looks like. And obviously, if Penn State finds a way to win this game, it completely not only changes the narrative of their season, but what the Big Ten East is going to look like now the rest of the season.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this game was always thought it was going to be one of the big heavyweight games in the league, and it is. And Penn State is definitely good enough to beat Michigan, okay, if they play their best game. And they're going to have to play their best game of the season to do that. But they have the talent to do that. Their defense is talented enough to give problems to J.J. McCarthy and the Michigan offense, right? Their offense, if Drew Aller continues to take a step from where he played against Maryland a week ago and not regress to the way he played against Ohio State, they have a chance, to be competitive. So, and they're playing at home, which to me is a big advantage for them. It's not going to be a night game. It's not going to be a whiteout. I think it's a stripe out like we saw in that opener against West Virginia, but it'll be a lively crowd, and it'll be a challenge for Michigan. Now, as we've seen, Michigan's team seems to be very resilient and very focused and, very about their business. So I think they'll be ready for that game. It'll be interesting to see, again, if anything is done by Big Ten Commissioner Tony Petitti between now and then that affects Michigan as they go to that game. I mean, if there's any kind of a suspension of Jim Harbaugh or any kind of consequences for that program between now and the start of that game at noon on Saturday, that'll be interesting to see and kind of what effect that may have on the team. So, but I think it's going to be a heck of a football game. I think the one thing Penn State still has to be, thinking about and kind of why they had this game circled. Last year in the game in Ann Arbor, Penn State gave up 418 yards rushing to Michigan. Okay. Now, Michigan is not the same running team as they were a year ago. I don't think this version of the offensive line is quite as good as the one they had last year. Not quite. And they haven't relied on the run as much as they have the pass this year. So it's a different offense. But nonetheless, Manny Diaz and that Penn State defense, they definitely remember what that felt like and what it looked like, and will want to put their best foot forward in this one on Saturday.
Will be a fascinating matchup. I know that everybody will be glued to the screen, making sure that they're tuned in to see how Michigan handles that. If not, you should head over to Peacock, which we'll get to in a second. But let's quickly hit on that Rutgers-Iowa game because there's a lot of implications. Big Ten West, certainly if Iowa can't win. And I'll be honest with you, I think if Rutgers plays the way they did last week, they could or should win that game against the Hawkeyes.
I think Rutgers will win the game. And like you said, if they take that what happened last week, use it as a positive, because they're going to go out there. Neither team throws the ball really well. They both play defense. They both want to run the ball, and I think Rutgers is a better running football team than Iowa is, at least more consistent. So it's not going to matter what the weather's like. It's not going to matter. I just think I would take Gavin Wimsatt right now over Deacon Hill at the quarterback position to make a couple plays, whether it's as a runner or a thrower. And I just think, they're both going to play great defense. And I think Rutgers runs the ball as a team a little bit better than Iowa. So I think they have a great chance of going in there and winning the football game. But, again, Iowa is Iowa, and they do what they do. They're sitting there in first place in the Big Ten West. Kirk Ferentz is this is his team, and they play the way he wants them to play. And so, it'll be a big time home environment for the Hawkeyes.
That's exactly it. It's at Kinnick, and I'm not saying that Kinnick is Beaver Stadium, but Kinnick is a fantastic scene. Those fans are into it. They're locked in from start to finish. They love when Torrey Taylor's out there. There's little boosts of confidence and energy that they can provide. So that'll be a fun one to watch as well. Maybe not a whole lot of points, but should be a tight ball game. Other games outside of that, Indiana, Illinois, Northwestern, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Purdue, all of those will have implications as well in the Big Ten West. And Minnesota at Purdue, 3:30 p.m. on NBC. Let's go to the noon game on Peacock, as mentioned, Maryland at Nebraska. You brought it up, and I'll say it again. This is essentially a battle for bowl eligibility at this point because both are 5-4. One has lost 4 in a row. The other one felt like they had all the momentum in the world heading into last week and then dropped a shocking result to Michigan State. So 2 coaches, I think, that we both have a lot of respect and admiration for, and Mike Loxley and Matt Rule, and should be an interesting matchup where it's all said and done as this one again, noon on Peacock.
Yeah, I think it's an intriguing game because the strengths are very different for these 2 teams. So Maryland, at least on paper going in, the strength of their team is their offense with their veteran quarterback, Talia Tagovailoa, right, and their weapons. And the strength of Nebraska is their defense. They've played outstanding defense, really, ever since the loss to Michigan at home 3 or 4 weeks ago. Their defense has played at a very high level. They don't play great on offense. And so it'll be interesting. But I think when it's all said and done, I think Nebraska is a little bit more of a physical, push you around kind of team, more so than Maryland. I just anticipate, weather and just kind of a cold day out in Lincoln. And that's a great home environment as well. So, but both teams playing for their bowl lives. And I kind of like where Nebraska is, even though both teams lost last week. I kind of like where Nebraska will be in this one.
Yeah, and that one will be, to your point, 2 teams kind of in opposite directions. At some point, you feel like Maryland's going to figure it out. You would just think at some point that they're going to find a way to finish this season on a high note. But the last 4 weeks have been really – I shouldn't even say the last 4 weeks, or I guess with a bye week, yes. But the last 3 games for them have been really concerning. The game against Ohio State, they played well in.
Right. But last week, what happened at home to Penn State is demoralizing. I mean, that is going to be hard to come back from because you got embarrassed at home, in front of your home crowd, in front of a TV audience. And so that's a tough one to come back from. Not saying they can't, but that last loss was the worst loss by far.
Moving to our game, 7:30 p.m. on NBC College Countdown, as always, at 7 o'clock on NBC. Michigan State, number 1 Ohio State in the college football playoff ranking. Again, we're recording this on Tuesday morning, so if anything changes in the ranking, we are unaware of it, but we will break those down if it does happen next week. This is, again, Harlan Barnett, first win for Michigan State. Really happy for him. Caden Hauser gets his first win as a starter. He didn't necessarily put up crazy numbers, but he did a good job of maintaining the game and in keeping the ball out of harm's way last week against Nebraska. Ohio State is Ohio State. We've talked about their defense winning them games. We've talked about Kyle McCord over the course of the season getting better at the quarterback spot. We talked about what a healthy Travion Henderson means for them. But let's hit on Marvin Harrison Jr. again. And you mentioned the numbers, just 4 catches last week, didn't have crazy yardage, but he did have the 2 touchdowns in his 4 catches. I think he was right in that kind of top 5 for the Heisman heading into last week. And I'm not sure that he's completely fallen off altogether. But if he does want a legitimate Heisman candidacy, which, again, we've talked to him and he's like, look, I don't care necessarily about winning it, but he would love to be at New York. He'd love to be honored in that way. And he knows that he has to rely on so many other people to make sure that his numbers are where they need to be. But I just do believe that, again, if we're honoring the best player in college football, he has to be at least in the conversation. That's all I ask.
Well, he's definitely one of the best players in college football, whether his numbers say it or not on a week-to-week basis. I mean, look, it's difficult for a wide receiver to win the Heisman Trophy. Now, Devontae Smith won it for Alabama a couple years ago. That was during the COVID year. Not everybody was playing. Not everybody was playing full seasons, and that offense was unstoppable and went on to win a national championship. But, he still is a great player. The thing about it is, he doesn't return kicks or do anything, extra that sets him apart other than the fact that he's a phenomenal wide receiver. So I think he definitely is in the conversation. I think he should definitely be in New York. but a wide receiver is always going to be a bit of a dark horse to have a chance to win it, because what used to be totally a running back award has now kind of morphed into a quarterback award. And so it's difficult for a wide receiver, but he's still a great player. Here's the thing about Ohio State is we still have not really seen them fully together and healthy, right? I mean, Emeka Egbuka has not looked 100%. I mean, he came back last week, but he seemed like he was limited. Last week, Cade Stover didn't play. He was limited. Denzel Burke played the week before, didn't play last week. Travion Henderson missed 3 games, has been back for 2. So, I don't think it's going to matter this week, but I think, again, as they get ready to play Michigan at the end of the year, they need all of their guys. They need all those guys to go to Ann Arbor and have a chance to win and turn around that 2-game losing streak to the Wolverines. So when they have all their guys, they're pretty awesome. Now, Kyle McCord, the last 2 weeks, I don't think he's played great. He didn't play great the game we had him against Wisconsin, and he didn't play great against Rutgers. And that's part of why Marvin Harrison only had 4 catches for 25 yards. But again, Rutgers is a top 10 defense. Their corners are really good. And when you don't have Egbuka out there at 100%, you don't have Cade Stover out there, you can pay a lot of attention to Marvin Harrison Jr. and kind of take him out of some normal things. That's why those other guys being healthy is so important. That's why Travion Henderson has made such a huge impact the last 2 weeks.
I did love seeing Marvin Sr. in the crowd at Rutgers, arms folded, complete blank stare, just exactly, I would say, analyzing everything his son did from like the top, and nobody was near him. He's like, nope, I'm going to sit alone. Do not come near me. And I think it was well understood over there in Piscataway. Let's just move on quickly to our Xfinity big connections on and off the field. And it's fun. We're in the crossover season now, Todd. This is a good time of year where you've got football, you've got basketball, all coming together. So apparently the Xfinity big connections is me. I'm the connection.
You're the connection.
And I am, yes. This weekend, we are in Columbus for the first time this year. And on Friday, I will be doing the Texas A&M Ohio State game on Peacock. That is the number 15 Texas A&M basketball team against an unranked but hungry Ohio State basketball team in Columbus. That'll be a lot of fun. Ohio State got their first win of the season on Monday against Oakland, and Texas A&M just completely was dominant in their first game as well. So that'll be fun. And then on Saturday, we get to call Ohio State and Michigan State. So I was told by Matt Lamb, our producer, that I am the connection for the week. And I got to say, it's an honor.
Yeah. Well, hey, the Schottenstein Center, you'll be in the Schott on Friday night. I've spent many a days in there watching Ohio high school state basketball tournaments. I used to take my sons, used to make a road trip to Columbus every year with my boys and watch all 3 days, 12 games of high school basketball, a great arena to watch.
Is it there every year, the high school?
Yeah, every year. And it used to be at St. John's Arena, which is their original place, which was a much smaller venue, made the tickets a lot harder to come by for state playoffs. But yeah, the Schott's a cool place.
All right, so I've changed it. Our Xfinity big connections for the week are Noah Eagle and Todd Blackledge, as Todd Blackledge makes his return to the great state of Ohio as well for this week. So plenty of connections. Excited to get over there to Columbus. We got to hit our Xfinity fan questions as well. We were in Ann Arbor last week, and some Michigan fans weighed in. Let's take a listen to what our first question of the week is.
Hey, Noah and Todd, who poses a bigger threat to the Wolverines? A road game against Penn State or a home game against the Buckeyes? Go Blue, beat Ohio.
Really delivered with good energy as well. So that first test is this week against Penn State. What do you think, Todd?
Well, I think Ohio State is a better team than Penn State, as was evidenced when they played a few weeks ago. However, playing Ohio State in Ann Arbor as opposed to playing Penn State in State College in Happy Valley in front of that 107,000 people, that's tough. And that's going to be a tough environment for Michigan. So I kind of see that as a toss-up. I mean, I'm not evading the question, but I think Ohio State's a better team, but you got them at home. Penn State's home field advantage is legit. And, Michigan went in there 2 years ago in 21 and won, but this is a better version, I think, of Penn State, particularly defensively, than they were 2 years ago.
It is. The one thing I will say, Penn State, the quote is that they are hopeful that Chop Robinson is going to play. I think that changes a lot. If Chop Robinson is in there and he's healthy and he's what we know he's capable of being, that defense looks a lot different than without him. And Adisa Isaac is wonderful on the other side as an edge rusher, but Chop Robinson is special. And when you've got the two-headed monster, now you can't double team one of them because then you're going to give up too much real estate to the other one. I tend to go with Ohio State here. I just tend to think that their defense is so buttoned up right now. They've got all the pieces. You mentioned it. They need to be healthy, and they need to be healthy on both sides. And I think Cade Stover is probably the X factor there. If Cade Stover is healthy offensively, it changes a lot. And I think that's a big reason, to your point, that Marvin Harrison Jr. had only 25 yards last week because Ibuka was coming back, probably on a pitch count. And then you've got Cade Stover out there. And G. Scott had a couple nice catches. He had a touchdown in his replacement. But Cade Stover has turned himself into one of the best tight ends in all of college football and a great third down option for Kyle Ford as a security blanket. So interesting stuff. We'll see the first of those two this week. Let's go to question number 2.
Hey guys, it's Jason from New Jersey. Just wondering if we end up losing to Ohio State. I know we had in the last 2 years, but if we lose this year, is there still any chance we make the playoff?
Jason from New Jersey, baby. Jason from New Jersey.
You love that, aren't you?
Yeah, it was an excellent question. Good question, though. Ohio State obviously lost to Michigan last year at the end of the year and still made the playoff. Do you think the Wolverines could do the same thing?
Well, I think it's certainly possible, right? I mean, in the same kind of scenario as what happened last year. The difference, though, and we talked about this in the very beginning, right now you've got the top 5 teams in the first CFP ranking that are still undefeated. And there are going to be some very interesting decisions that have to be made by potential one-loss conference champions. I mean, you could have a one-loss Oregon as the Pac-12 champion. You could have a one-loss potential Texas as a Big 12 champion. You could have a one-loss SEC champion in Alabama, and which would also mean a one-loss Georgia team potentially. So it's going to be very interesting. I think there'll be more competition for that one-loss team to make it in the college football playoff this year than there was a year ago.
And that's why my answer is probably no. I just think that there's too many good teams, unless chaos ensues these final 3 weeks, which is very possible. I just think when you look at the schedules and you look at the probabilities of how everything shakes out, what if Texas now runs the table? Now they're a one-loss team. You mentioned Washington. If they lose in the Pac-12 championship game, well, they've had some big wins, and especially even if they then went undefeated these last 3 weeks of the regular season, those are big wins. And I just don't know if Michigan's resume will stack up with that. But it's all big ifs, and we're going to get to see if they can do it this week. Then they get Maryland next week, which if Maryland gets back on a winning track, maybe they look at that game a little bit differently. And then, of course, the big one at the end of the year. So we'll all see what it looks like. But I just think that this year is tougher as a one-loss team, as a non-conference champion one-loss team than it had been maybe a year ago.
And I think the other thing that we didn't mention in all that is not just those one-loss. Let's say Washington stays undefeated, even though they got a tough road here the next 3 weeks, plays Oregon, and Oregon wins, and they're both sitting there with one loss, right? So not only do you have those scenarios, same thing in the SEC, you potentially are going to have an undefeated ACC champion, Florida State, who is also sitting there, So that's another spot at the table that really was not a factor last year. So it's going to be very difficult, I think, for any of those conferences to get 2 teams in this year because of the way it's playing out.
Yeah, Ohio State doesn't get in a year ago if USC wins that Pac-12 championship. In all likelihood, USC was in prime position. They probably would have been in that top 4. They lose to Utah, and they fall completely out of it. And then, of course, it kind of goes off the rails into the bowl season. All right, we got one final question. Let's see what that is.
What's up, guys? I'm Dev from Connecticut. I'm just wondering, because it feels like every year Michigan makes the college football playoffs and does not win. What do they have to do to finally take home the title this year?
How Dev from Connecticut putting on the helmet too. He's going all in for it. It looked like a Michigan basketball jersey as well. All right, so now we're back into the what ifs. If Michigan does run the table here, they go undefeated, they win the Big Ten again. They are 100% a shoo-in at that point to be in the college football playoff. I think that we kind of know the answer of what makes them different this year than what they had been the last 2 years. I think let's start with the first college football playoff appearance they had. They just weren't as good as the teams they had to go up against, really all other three teams. Last year they were. That was the difference. They were better than they were the year prior, and they just maybe underestimated TCU a little bit. J.J. McCarthy throws a couple of pick sixes in that game, and they got behind the 8 ball, almost come back to win it. That, to me, feels like the difference this year, right, is the quarterback play. What do you think of Michigan's chances, and I guess what do they need to do to kind of take that next step?
Yeah, I think 100% right. It's J.J. McCarthy and their passing game this year that is much better, much more efficient, much more explosive than it's been the last 2 years when they were in the college football playoff. In 21, Cade McNamara was the quarterback. They went up against Georgia, who eventually won the national championship, and they really posed no threat to the Georgia defense because they weren't good enough throwing the football. Last year against TCU, it was more a combination of some unusual mistakes. Michigan didn't make a lot of mistakes. 2 pick sixes thrown by J.J. McCarthy. He's a much better player this year, a much more efficient quarterback, much more better decision maker. He understands the offense, and he has played lights out since the Bowling Green game in week 3 when he threw 3 interceptions. All 3 of his interceptions came in that one game. So he's played at an extremely high level, and because of that, I think they have what it takes now to go into the college football playoff and win.
Couldn't argue with that. I'd say you said it perfectly. Before we wrap up, any other games you want to hit on? A couple big ones in the SEC, a couple big ones in the Pac-12. Anything that stands out as we head into this final stretch of 3 weeks left in the regular season?
No, I nothing really, no other game to talk about. But I do want to give a shout out to my man Biff Poggi and the 49ers. Got an overtime win on the road against Tulsa. They were down 17 in the fourth quarter, came back and won in overtime. So I was with Biff last night and had a chance to congratulate him. So 3 wins now on the year for the 49ers in their first year as members of the American Athletic Conference.
Slowly building, man. Slowly building. You can see kind of those bricks and that foundation being laid, and I'm excited to see what they look like moving forward. Look, if they can somehow find a way to run the table, that'd be a bowl-eligible first season for Biff Poggi and the Charlotte 49ers. But nice to see another victory for them and a resolve as well. All right, that does it for us. We appreciate you for tuning in. Big Talk with Todd and Noah. Don't forget, we are presented by Xfinity 10G Network, and you can download and subscribe on the NBC Sports YouTube channel and wherever you get your audio podcasts. As always, we'll talk to you next week.